When we think about medieval kings and queens, we usually picture tall stone castles, long red carpets, and a bunch of people bowing every few minutes. We imagine shiny crowns, big feasts, and a royal voice that always sounds like they've swallowed a trumpet. But behind all that royal sparkle, these people were still human. And just like every human, they had habits, some normal, some odd, and some so strange that even their pet cat probably raised an eyebrow. Tonight, we're going to step inside that quieter side of the medieval world, the secret corners where royalty hid their little quirks. Nothing dramatic, nothing wild, just a slow walk through the private habits they never wanted written in the official royal history book. Perfect for bedtime. So lie back, take a breath, and let's begin with a soft stroll into the private world of kings and queens who never expected anyone to talk about these things hundreds of years later, especially not in a sleepy YouTube video. In the daytime, medieval royalty lived a very public life. Everything they did was watched, judged, and whispered about. A king could sneeze too loudly, and suddenly people might say it was a sign from the heavens. A queen could trip on a stair, and someone would write a poem about how it symbolized the fall of the kingdom. There was no space for being relaxed, no space for being a regular person. So naturally, the real them, their little routines, their odd preferences, their quiet comforts, came out only when the court wasn't watching. Imagine a king who spent the day sitting on a huge throne, holding a heavy sword, pretending to look very serious. But at night, he tiptoes down the hall to look at his secret shelf of tiny carved wooden animals, each one lined up by size. Or imagine a queen who had to greet ambassadors all morning, but secretly refused to drink from any cup unless she touched it 3 times for good luck. These things were harmless, peaceful, and very human. But because kings and queens were supposed to look perfect, they tried to hide these habits like they were guarding treasure. Now, medieval castles were big, echoing places. Cold stone walls, long corridors, huge rooms that took forever to walk across. You'd think someone could hide anything inside a castle that large. But no, servants were everywhere, advisors were everywhere, guards stood around like decorative plants. So if a royal had a strange habit, they had to be very careful. One wrong move, and suddenly the whole castle knew. And once the castle knew, well, medieval gossip traveled faster than medieval horses. Some royals actually created routines to cover up their habits. If a king didn't want people to see him carrying a little lucky charm, he might hide it in his sleeve or in his boot. If a queen loved singing quietly to herself before bed, she might order her servants to leave torches burning loudly so no one heard her humming. And if a prince had a habit that made him seem a bit odd, sometimes his servants would create a story that made him look more mysterious instead of silly. Oh, no, he isn't doing something strange. He is preparing for a very important spiritual ritual, that sort of thing. But why did they have these habits in the first place? Well, medieval life was stressful. Ruling a kingdom wasn't exactly a calm job. One moment, you're hosting a feast, the next you're signing a treaty, the next you're hearing someone complain that a sheep wandered into the royal garden again. And on top of that, people back then believed in all sorts of signs, omens, dreams, and lucky symbols. A lot of their habits came from superstition, some came from tradition. Some simply came from trying to find comfort in a world that didn't have pillows as soft as the ones you have right now. Even the most powerful rulers, people who commanded armies, collected taxes, and made laws, still got nervous, lonely, or overwhelmed. And when humans feel overwhelmed, well, we all reach for things that make us feel safe. A favorite object, a strange little ritual, a quiet routine before sleep. These habits helped them feel in control of a world that was often unpredictable. Of course, the funny part is that many of these habits were so harmless that no one today would think twice about them. But back then, royal image was everything. If a king liked to walk in circles before making a decision, people might think he had a magical connection to invisible spirits. If a queen spent too much time staring at the moon, they might think she was reading messages from the sky. In reality, the poor woman probably just needed 5 minutes of peace away from everyone. And let's be honest, if any of us lived in a giant, cold stone building with no heaters, dim rooms, and 100 people asking for favors every day, we'd also develop some strange habits. Maybe you'd always sit on the same step of the stairs. Maybe you'd insist on drinking from the same cup. Maybe you'd count the windows each night before sleeping. These little things make life feel familiar. So, as we begin this journey through 15 medieval royals and their hidden habits, remember this: these people may have worn crowns and fancy robes, but inside, they were just trying to get through each day like anyone else, trying to stay calm, trying to stay lucky, trying to feel a little bit normal in a world where everyone expected them to be perfect. And that's why this topic is oddly comforting, because when we hear about a king who had to knock on a door twice for good luck, or a queen who collected weird little objects, it reminds us that humans have always been quirky, even powerful humans. We meet one such king, a man who ruled lands, commanded knights, and signed important papers with a giant feather, but still refused to start his day unless certain signs looked just right. He wasn't dramatic about it, of course. He just believed the world talked to him through tiny hints. And honestly, who can blame him? When you're king, even a squeaky door can feel like a message from destiny. This king began each morning in a very particular way. Before breakfast, before meetings, even before someone ran in with news about another argument between nobles, he would sit on the edge of his bed and wait. What was he waiting for? Well, a sign. Any sign. A bird chirping at the window, the fire crackling in a certain rhythm, a servant sneezing exactly once, not twice. If nothing happened, he would quietly hum and tap his fingers on his knee until he felt something shift. Some kings needed advisors. This king needed vibes. His servants understood this routine better than anyone. They knew that if they rushed him, the rest of the day would feel wrong to him, and he might avoid important decisions. So they let him sit there, sometimes for minutes, sometimes longer, just listening to the world. And while the whole castle whispered about their king having a connection to unseen forces, most of them secretly found it comforting. Better a king who listens too much than a king who listens to no one at all. Now, this king had a particular love for charms. Small objects he believed held special meaning. Not big, magical items, nothing dramatic. Just tiny things that helped him feel safe. A smooth stone, a carved bit of wood, a ribbon wrapped around a coin. He kept them tucked into pockets, sleeves, and even inside his boots. If he lost one, he believed the day would collapse into chaos. If he found one unexpectedly, he believed the universe was giving him a gentle pat on the back. Once, during a long meeting, one of his charms slipped out of his sleeve and rolled across the table. The advisors stared at it as if a dragon had landed on the table. But the king simply picked it up, smiled awkwardly, and said it helped him think. Everyone nodded very seriously, pretending this was the most normal thing they had ever seen. His habits didn't stop there. He treated every decision like it was part logic, part secret sign from the universe. If he had to choose between two messages, he would watch how the candle flames moved. If he needed to pick a date for a feast, he waited for a day when the wind blew softly through the east window. And if anyone questioned him, he calmly said, "Everything has its time. I'm just listening." At night, things became even more interesting. When the castle halls grew quiet and torches burned low, the king walked softly through the corridors, checking on small symbols carved into the walls. Some he carved himself, some were older than the castle. They weren't magical symbols, at least not in the dramatic sense. They were simple markings that helped him feel grounded. A circle for peace, a crosshatch for protection, a tiny arrow for guidance. He believed checking them kept the kingdom safe. Of course, there were rumors. There always are. Some whispered the king had secret knowledge. Others thought he was speaking with spirits. One guard claimed the king would pause in the hallway, tilt his head, and receive messages from the stones. In reality, the king was probably just thinking, or trying to remember if he left a charm back in his room. But rumors love exaggeration, especially when they involve kings. Still, the king never corrected anyone. He didn't want people to think he was strange, but he also didn't want to pretend he wasn't a little superstitious. So he simply let people believe what they wanted. And honestly, it made him seem mysterious in a harmless, almost cozy way. People felt like their king was tuned into something deeper, something protective. If a king believed strongly in good signs, then surely good things would come. That was the logic of many in the castle. One of his funniest habits involved food. Before he ate anything, he would tap the plate once with his spoon, just once. Not twice, not loudly, just a small, quiet tap to make sure everything was in harmony. The cooks didn't mind. They thought it was cute in a royal sort of way. One cook even started tapping the plates herself before sending them up, just to help the king feel extra blessed. The king never noticed, but the cook felt proud of her teamwork with destiny. And despite all these rituals, the king wasn't dramatic. He didn't make speeches about destiny or talk about spirits. He just quietly followed his habits, as if he were tidying up puzzle pieces only he understood. These habits calmed him. They helped him start his day with confidence. And in a world full of battles, tricky politics, and winter storms that destroyed roofs, having a calming routine wasn't the worst thing in the world. Many people today think medieval kings were always bold and fearless, but even kings had fears. Even kings felt overwhelmed. And when life felt heavy, this king found comfort in patterns, in tiny signs, in small rituals that made a confusing world feel just a little more organized. Maybe that's why we still relate to people like him. Humans haven't changed as much as we think we have. We still look for signs, even if our signs today are traffic lights or phone notifications that tell us we're doing okay. So when you picture this king next time, imagine him sitting by his window in the early morning light, waiting for a bird to land on the ledge before he starts his day. Imagine him feeling calmer the moment it happens. Imagine him walking the halls at night with quiet footsteps, checking his little carvings, and whispering a thank you to the silence around him. Not because he ruled with magic, but because he ruled with small comforts. There was once a medieval queen who had one habit she tried very hard to keep quiet. She loved nighttime walks. Not short ones, not a little stroll to stretch her legs, but long, slow walks through the castle grounds when everyone else was asleep. She moved like a soft shadow, drifting through gardens, courtyards, long stone corridors, and anywhere the moonlight touched. During the day, she acted like a normal queen. Serious meetings, polite nods, royal posture, but as soon as the sun set, her mind began to glow with the thought of wandering under the stars. People in the castle thought she slept early because she always excused herself from evening gatherings with a gentle smile and a calm, "I feel a little tired." But the moment her door closed, she would slip into a simple cloak, quietly lift the latch, and head out into the cool night air. She never wore her crown, of course. Crowns are heavy, they shine too much, and they make a soft jingle sound that ruins the mood. She preferred to keep her hood up, letting the night hide her like a friend. Why did she love night walks so much? Well, daytime life in a castle was loud. Servants rushing everywhere, advisors arguing about taxes, knights clanking around in armor, and nobles telling long stories just to hear themselves talk. Even the tapestries seemed to stare at her. But at night, everything felt peaceful. The torches flickered softly, the gardens breathed slow and cool, and the stone walls seemed to relax after holding up the whole castle all day. She liked hearing nothing except her own footsteps. The queen didn't just wander without purpose. She had little stations she visited every night. There was a bench under an old willow tree where she liked to sit and watch the moonlight drip through the leaves. There was a small archway in the hallway near the kitchens, where the breeze always smelled faintly like bread. There was a stone balcony that let her look at the far trees, which made her feel like the world was much bigger than the castle walls. One of her favorite places was the quiet herb garden. During the day, it was full of busy hands, gardeners clipping and arranging plants, but at night, it looked like a patch of shadows with tiny glimmers of silver where moonlight touched the leaves. She liked brushing her hand lightly over the rosemary, smelling the sage, and standing still long enough to hear the night insects buzzing like sleepy musicians. Of course, she had to be careful. Queens were not supposed to wander around alone in the dark. If anyone found out, there would be meetings, scoldings, and at least 7 people assigned to watch her every move. She wanted her walks to stay private, so she learned how to move quietly, how to open doors without making a sound, and how to step on the parts of the floor that didn't creak. If you ever heard a small scrape at night, it wasn't a ghost. It was probably just the queen trying not to trip over her own cloak. Sometimes she encountered a guard on patrol and she froze. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want the poor guard to panic. If a queen appeared out of the dark suddenly, most guards would drop their torch, shout, or run for help thinking they saw a spirit. She waited in the shadows like a polite little owl until they passed. Then she continued her peaceful walk. She wasn't scared of the dark. In fact, she felt safer at night than in the daytime crowd. The darkness felt like a soft blanket. The moon felt like a companion who didn't ask questions, and the stars seemed like tiny lanterns reminding her she wasn't alone. She believed the night had its own wisdom, its own calm energy that helped her think clearly. Sometimes she whispered to herself while she walked, not dramatic speeches, more like small thoughts she didn't have time for during the day. Tomorrow, I'll talk to that farmer about the missing sheep. Maybe I should move the blue tapestry to the west wall. Did I remember to feed the castle cat? Simple thoughts, but they felt lighter in the night air. Her midnight habit wasn't harmful, but she still wanted it hidden. She didn't want people thinking she was strange. In medieval times, walking around at night could lead to all kinds of wild stories. Someone would say she was doing magic. Someone else would say she had secret meetings. Someone would claim she was trying to talk to the moon for advice. And she didn't want any of that. She just liked the quiet. One night, the queen walked farther than usual. She drifted down a narrow path behind the herb garden and found a small patch of wildflowers growing in a place she'd never noticed. The flowers were closed, sleeping peacefully. She sat beside them and watched the sky. For a long while, she didn't think anything. She just breathed. And she realized that the world didn't need her to be a queen in that moment. It only needed her to sit and exist. That simple thought brought her more peace than any gold crown ever could. Every night, after her walk, she returned the same way she came. She slipped back into her room, hung her cloak, brushed the dust off her slippers, and climbed into bed. And here's the funny part. She always pretended she had been sleeping the whole time. If someone knocked in the morning, she would stretch, yawn, and say, "Oh, such a deep sleep I had last night." She would never admit that she had seen half the castle at 1 in the morning. The servants eventually suspected something. They noticed her shoes were dirtier at sunrise than at sunset. They noticed her room sometimes smelled faintly of night air. One maid found a leaf in her cloak, but none of them said anything. They liked their queen. She was kind, and people who are kind deserve a few secrets. So the queen continued her nighttime wandering night after night, year after year. It became part of her, a soft ritual she carried through stressful times and happy times. And even though the world never knew about it, those quiet journeys under the moon helped her stay calm, steady, and warm-hearted. There was a medieval prince whose favorite place in the whole castle wasn't the throne room or the training yard or even the grand hall with the huge fireplace. His favorite place was the bath. Not just any bath, but a large wooden tub filled with warm water, herbs, oils, and whatever calming scents he could get his hands on. While other nobles were busy arguing about borders and taxes, this prince was slipping quietly into a tub that smelled like rosemary, lavender, and a hint of something flowery he never admitted he liked. Most people in medieval times didn't bathe very often. Water had to be heated by hand, tubs had to be carried around, and sometimes bathwater became a group project, which honestly just sounds stressful. But this prince? He loved bathing so much he would have done it every day if he could. He didn't care about the usual rules. He believed warm water helped him think, he believed herbs helped him relax, and he believed that no royal decision should be made while tense shoulders were involved. He had a whole routine, and it never changed. First, he checked the temperature of the water with exactly 2 fingers. If it was too hot, he frowned gently. If it was too cold, he sighed dramatically. The servants stood nearby holding buckets, waiting to adjust the hot or cold water like they were working with a very picky flower. Once the water reached the exact level of perfect, he stepped in slowly, letting out a soft, happy breath every time. The servants always pretended not to hear, but they heard everything. The prince didn't choose normal herbs either. He had a personal blend he created himself after many experiments. Lavender for calm, mint for clarity, chamomile to loosen the stress in his shoulders, and rose petals because he said they made the water look peaceful. No one dared to question that logic. If he wanted a floating garden in his bathtub, he was going to have it. He stayed in the tub for a long time, sometimes so long that servants wondered if he had fallen asleep. He often closed his eyes and let his mind drift, thinking about nothing and everything. Sometimes he came up with ideas for managing the kingdom. Sometimes he remembered a joke he heard a week ago and laughed quietly to himself. Sometimes he imagined he was a fish. Honestly, no one knows. The point is, the bath was his private world. And it wasn't just the water he cared about. The setting had to feel right, too. He preferred the chamber lit with just a few candles. If there were too many, he said the room felt judgy. If there were too few, he said the shadows made him feel like someone was hiding behind the towel rack. And so, 3 candles became his number. Always 3. No more, no less. The servants learned not to ask questions. They simply placed 1 candle on the windowsill, 1 by the tub, and 1 on a tiny wooden stool he used for his cup of warm herbal tea. This prince also had a rule that no one could disturb him during his bath unless the castle was literally on fire. Not maybe on fire. Not something looks smoky. Only actual fire. Because, as he calmly explained, a prince with half-washed hair is not fit to handle an emergency. Logical in its own strange way. Now, you might think he kept this habit totally secret, but castles are gossip factories. Servants talk, guards talk, even the cooks talk. Soon everyone knew the prince had bathing afternoons, as they called them. But out of respect, and maybe because they were afraid he'd ban them from hot soup forever, they kept quiet when higher-ranking nobles asked questions. Some people thought he bathed often because he liked being clean. Others thought he was using herbs to heal an illness. But the truth was simple. The prince liked warm water. It made him feel human. It made him feel calm. And it gave him space to think without 10 people shouting, "Your Highness," every 5 minutes. One day, a visiting noble accidentally walked into the bathing chamber, not knowing the prince was inside. The noble froze in horror. The prince froze too, but mostly because he didn't want to splash water everywhere. The noble started apologizing so fast it sounded like he was chanting a spell. The prince just waved him away and said, "Please close the door. The lavender is escaping." The noble shut the door as if his life depended on it. After that, people knocked 10 times before entering any room in the castle. Of course, there were moments when his habit caused trouble, like the time an important messenger came with urgent news about a border issue. The prince was in the bath, halfway through a long herbal soak, and when the messenger arrived, the servants whispered, "He's, unavailable." The messenger asked what that meant. The servants looked at each other and said, "He's, in deep thought," which technically wasn't a lie. By the time the prince finally emerged, smelling like a forest and looking extremely relaxed, the problem was already half solved. He claimed the warm water helped him think faster. No one argued. Another time, the prince tried to create his own bath mixture by crushing herbs together with a stone bowl. It looked impressive, but he misunderstood the difference between a few leaves and half the bag. When he stepped into the water, the scent was so strong he nearly sneezed himself out of the tub. After that, he left the herb mixing to the professionals. As the years went by, the prince's habit became less of a secret and more of a quiet castle tradition. People knew that when he was in the bath, he was at his calmest, kindest, and most reasonable. Some advisors even planned their meetings right after his bath because that was when he made his gentlest decisions. One once joked, "If we want a peaceful kingdom, we simply need to keep the bath full at all times." And maybe they were right, because whenever he stepped out of the water, wrapped in a soft robe, smelling like 10 gardens, he seemed ready to face anything. He felt rested, rebalanced, almost new. And although he never said it out loud, his baths made him feel like he wasn't just a prince trapped in duty, but a human being who deserved softness and peace, even in a hard world. That's why he protected the habit so carefully. It wasn't just water and herbs. It was his moment of warmth in a world of cold stone halls, his quiet space in a life full of noise. And as we leave him sinking gently into the warm water, eyes half closed, steam rising around him, we move to the next royal, someone who found comfort not in warm baths, but in the quiet company of animals.
If you've ever met someone who treats their pets like royalty, well, this medieval king was on a whole different level. In fact, some people joked that if they ever came back in their next life, they'd rather come back as one of his animals, because those creatures lived better than most humans in the kingdom. And honestly, they were not wrong. This king, who ruled a fairly large stretch of land, had an unusual habit that every historian quietly laughs about. He didn't just love animals, he adored them. He cherished them, he pampered them, and in some cases, he listened to them more than he listened to actual human advisors. Imagine being a serious political counselor with a long beard, a long robe, and a very long list of problems to discuss. You walk into the royal chamber ready to deliver urgent news, and the king says, "Not now, the royal dog is upset." That was the vibe. Now, before we judge too quickly, let's remember. The medieval world was stressful. Cold winters, heavy taxes, surprise wars, plagues. Maybe spending time with pets was his way of keeping himself sane, but still, he took it to an extreme. He had royal cats, royal parrots, royal dogs, royal rabbits, and even a royal goat that followed him around like a little bodyguard. That goat, by the way, was supposedly very protective. One old story says that when a nobleman bowed too quickly in front of the king, the goat charged at him like, "Hey buddy, slow down, that's my king you're leaning toward." But this king's love for animals wasn't just cute, it actually shaped his entire daily routine. For example, he had a rule that none of his pets should ever be left alone. If one of his dogs fell asleep, a servant had to sit beside it until it woke up. If the royal cat climbed onto the king's bed during a meeting, the meeting was postponed because the cat is resting. You'd think the cat was the one in charge of the kingdom. His servants had mixed feelings. On one hand, caring for animals wasn't the worst job in medieval times. On the other hand, imagine the stress of making sure a royal parrot ate only the freshest fruits, or making sure a royal goose had its favorite warm bath ready at sunset. Yes, the goose had a bath time schedule. Historians didn't make that up. Someone in medieval times had the job of goose bath keeper, probably not the career they dreamed of as a child. And the food. The food. Some people in the kingdom barely had a loaf of bread, but these royal animals ate like they were attending a 5-course banquet every day. There was soft bread soaked in honey. There were bowls of gently warmed goat milk, stirred slowly so it wouldn't form bubbles. There were baskets of fruit, tiny bowls of nuts, and even special desserts. One court record even mentioned a birthday feast for the king's oldest dog. The dog, who honestly had no idea what was happening, sat on a velvet cushion while musicians played soft tunes and guests clapped politely. That must have been the strangest party any medieval noble ever attended. Now, because the king's love for animals was so famous, other rulers sometimes gifted him rare creatures during diplomatic visits. Instead of bringing gold or fancy fabrics, ambassadors would bring exotic birds, unusual dogs, or strange little animals no one in the kingdom had ever seen before. Some animals were adorable, some were questionable. One ambassador brought a monkey that kept escaping and stealing fruit from the royal kitchen. Another brought a bird that screamed every morning at sunrise like an alarm clock that no one could turn off. The king adored them all, the servants, not so much. The funniest part of all this was how much the king trusted his animals. If he was unsure about a decision, he'd sometimes watch the behavior of his pets for a sign. If the royal cat sat near a certain scroll on the table, he took it as a message. If the goat walked toward a certain direction in the courtyard, the king believed fate was pointing him there. Basically, these animals were the unofficial counsel. They didn't speak, but their random movements somehow influenced important choices. The kingdom probably survived by pure luck. But even though this king's habits seemed unusual, many people secretly appreciated his gentler side. He wasn't cruel, he wasn't quick-tempered, he wasn't the type to punish people harshly. Maybe because he spent so much time around animals, he learned to be patient, calm, and soft-hearted. Some historians actually think his animal-loving nature made him a kinder ruler overall. There's also a story about a time when his kingdom was preparing for a small conflict. You know, one of those little medieval disagreements where everyone usually ends up fighting. His generals stood around a big table with maps explaining strategies. But the whole meeting was delayed because the king's favorite dog had fallen asleep on the table, right on top of the war map. No one dared move it. The generals stood there waiting awkwardly while the dog snored. Eventually, the king walked in and said, "Well, if the dog is sleeping on the battlefield, perhaps we should avoid fighting there." And believe it or not, he changed the whole plan because of that moment. The generals didn't complain. They simply nodded. After all, arguing with the king was risky, but arguing with the king's dog was even worse. One thing people noticed was that the king's eyes brightened when he was around animals. It was like they brought him a kind of peace he couldn't find anywhere else. In a time when life was tough and leaders carried heavy responsibilities, maybe this was his escape. He'd sit in the gardens, resting his hand on his dog's head, watching birds flutter around the trees. No royal crown, no royal duties, just a man enjoying simple company. Of course, rumors eventually spread. Some said he would rather talk to animals than humans. Others claimed he asked animals for advice. Medieval gossip was wild, but the truth was probably simpler. He was lonely. Ruling a kingdom could isolate anyone. When people want something from you all the time, animals become the only ones who show you pure affection. Maybe he found comfort in that. Toward the end of his life, the king made an unusual request. He wanted to be buried with 2 of his favorite pets. The royal court didn't argue. They knew the animals were like family to him. And after he passed, those pets were laid to rest beside him, a final reminder of the strange but gentle king who loved them more than he loved most people. Today, historians talk about him with a little smile, not because he was foolish, but because his quirks made him human. In a world full of battles, politics, and heavy crowns, this king chose to focus on kindness, softness, and the comfort of furry friends. Maybe that's why his story still feels warm, even after all these centuries.
Medieval castles were big, cold, echoing places. Doors creaked, floors groaned, and wind whistled through cracks in the stone walls. So it's no surprise that many royals had strange bedtime routines. But none were as unusual or as legendary as this princess and her so-called good luck noises. She wasn't a dramatic princess or a spoiled one. Actually, she was pretty gentle, shy even. But every night, when the moon was high and the halls grew quiet, she insisted on a very specific nighttime ritual. Without it, she refused to sleep. And when a royal refuses to sleep, the entire castle refuses to sleep too. That's just how medieval life worked. The princess believed that certain sounds brought her safety, blessings, and peaceful dreams. Not music, not prayers, just sounds. Random, simple, everyday noises that she decided were magical. And once she decided something, there was no arguing. So while other people enjoyed silence, she wanted the opposite. She wanted a small orchestra of noises every single night. Her favorite noise was the sound of someone gently tapping wood. Not loud, just a soft tap, tap, tap rhythm. She said it reminded her of rain on the roof during storms she remembered from childhood. The problem is, rain happens naturally. Tapping does not. Someone had to do it. So the castle assigned a special servant whose entire job was to sit on a wooden stool outside the princess's room and tap a piece of wood. All night long. Imagine that being your job. Not fighting battles, not working in the kitchen, not serving food, just gently tapping wood for hours until sunrise. And if the tapping slowed down or the rhythm changed, oh, she knew. She always knew. She'd call out softly through the door, "Please keep the rhythm. It brings me peace." And the poor servant would straighten up and start tapping again like their life depended on it. But the tapping was only one of her required noises. She also needed the sound of crackling fire, even in summer when the castle was already warm. So her fireplace was always lit. The servants brought in dry sticks and special wood that burned with a crisp snap. The princess said the crackling reminded her of old stories her mother told beside the hearth. The smoke was not her problem. The heat was not her problem. It was all about the noise. Then came the strange one. She needed the sound of a goat. Not a loud goat, not a screaming goat, just a soft, gentle bleat every once in a while. She said it calmed her heart. Apparently, when she was younger, the castle kept goats near the walls, and she grew up hearing them at night. So the goat noise became part of her comfort. Instead of, letting goats wander the hallway, which would have been chaotic, the castle found a calm little goat and housed it in a cozy room nearby. A servant sat with it each night, encouraging it to make tiny sounds. Not too often, not too quiet. Just enough that the princess could drift off peacefully. Sleep researchers today would have a field day with this. One ambassador visiting the castle once asked why the halls echoed with such strange nighttime sounds. Someone tried to explain the princess's routine, and the ambassador simply nodded, trying not to look confused. Medieval diplomacy meant pretending everything was normal, even when it absolutely was not. Still, the princess wasn't unreasonable. She knew people worked hard to make her feel comfortable, so she tried to be kind. Every morning, she thanked the servants personally. She even had little pastries prepared for them as a reward. The tapping servant probably ate more pastries than anyone else in the castle. But the real challenge came during travel. Whenever the princess had to visit another court, say for political meetings or celebrations, her night routine became a major problem because if she couldn't sleep, then nobody slept. And if she slept badly, she was grumpy the next day, and medieval politics were already bad enough without sleep-deprived royalty on the edge of emotional collapse. So whenever she traveled, her team had to pack everything: special firewood,
the wooden tapping board, the stool, and of course, the goat. Yes, the goat traveled too, in a special little wagon, probably the most pampered goat in the entire medieval era. Other royal courts didn't know what to make of this. Imagine being a host king trying to be polite while your guest demands a room with a goat in the next chamber. You just smile and pretend this was normal, even if your mind was screaming, "Why is this happening?" But despite how odd her habits were, the princess was well loved. People found her routines silly but sweet. She wasn't bossy, she didn't shout, and she didn't punish anyone. Instead, she apologized when things were difficult. She knew her habits seemed strange, but to her, they were part of feeling safe in a world where life was unpredictable and often scary. And truthfully, the medieval world wasn't gentle, especially for a young royal. Many princesses were raised under heavy pressure to marry, negotiate alliances, and smile politely even when they felt overwhelmed. Maybe her good luck noises were her way of staying grounded, a calming ritual, a little island of peace in a chaotic kingdom. There's a famous story about a night when the castle had to take shelter due to a sudden storm. Lightning struck close by, people ran through the halls, guards shouted orders, and yet in all the chaos, someone remembered. The princess needs her noises. Even in the middle of a storm emergency, they found a way to bring the tapping board, light a small fire, and settle the goat nearby. She reportedly fell asleep almost instantly, even while thunder shook the castle. Ironically, she slept better during the storm than everyone else did. Another story tells of a night when the goat refused to bleat. It just sat there, silently, stubborn as a rock. The servant tried everything, offering food, scratching behind the ears, even softly encouraging it. Nothing. The goat was done, and without that sound, the princess couldn't settle. So the castle improvised. A brave servant stood behind a curtain and attempted to imitate a goat gently. They practiced the soft ma sound until they got it right. The princess slept like a baby. The next morning, she said, "The goat sounded especially peaceful last night." The servant just nodded, extremely proud and slightly embarrassed. As she grew older, her habits didn't disappear. They simply became part of the palace routine. Everyone learned to accept the nightly tapping, the warm fire, and the gentle goat sounds echoing through the halls. It was just the princess being herself. Some years later, when she finally married a foreign prince, people wondered how she would sleep in a new land. But surprisingly, her husband adapted quickly. Instead of complaining, he built her a special sound room with gentle tapping panels, a controlled crackling fire, and a carved wooden box that imitated animal noises. No goat needed. He understood her quirks were part of her charm. And maybe that's the hidden lesson in her story. Even in the strict and serious medieval world, people still had their strange comforts, their little rituals, their quiet ways of calming their minds. And sometimes, those rituals seem funny from the outside, but make perfect sense to the person who needs them. The princess with her good luck noises wasn't dramatic, wasn't spoiled, and wasn't foolish. She was simply someone who found peace in sound, someone who turned the echoing darkness of a medieval castle into a cozy, familiar lullaby. And honestly, who can blame her? Everyone has their own bedtime routines. Hers just happened to include a goat.
If you think modern people are obsessed with cleanliness, you should meet this medieval duke. He lived in an age when most folks bathed maybe once a week, or once a month, or, let's be honest, whenever they remembered. But not this man. He was the medieval king of washing hands, though he wasn't a king at all, just a very fancy noble with a very intense hygiene habit. He washed his hands constantly, morning, afternoon, evening, and all the tiny moments in between. Some records say he washed his hands 50 times a day. Others say more. One storyteller joked that if he shook your hand, he would wash his own immediately afterward and then politely offer you water so you could wash yours too. He wasn't trying to be rude. He just had a deep belief that clean hands led to a clean soul and a peaceful mind. His castle servants always carried basins of warm water around, ready to assist him.
Imagine walking behind a nobleman all day with a bowl, a towel, and a tiny jar of herbs so the water smelled nice. It was a full-time job. And if the Duke touched something unexpected, like a dusty tapestry or a doorknob, he would instantly stretch out his hands like, "Water, please." Even during important meetings, he paused to wash. Once, during a serious discussion about taxes, he stopped everything to dip his hands into lavender water while everyone awkwardly waited. The funniest part was the towel situation. He refused to use the same towel twice. Absolutely refused. Each towel had to be clean, fresh, and soft enough to meet his standards. The castle laundry workers probably never got a day off. They washed towels all day, dried towels all night, folded towels until their fingers cramped. Towels were everywhere, in baskets, in hallways, in storage rooms, and probably even stuffed into corners where people hid them temporarily. Now, was he afraid of germs? That's the surprising thing. Medieval people didn't even know germs existed yet. He just had a feeling, an intuition that hands should be spotless. It was his personal philosophy. Some called it strange, some called it wise, and some just shrugged and said, "At least he smells better than everyone else." But his habit went beyond washing. He would not touch food with bare fingers, ever. He used long, narrow utensils for everything, even picking up grapes. One servant was assigned to peel fruit so he wouldn't have to touch the skins. Bread was sliced into tiny pieces so he could spear them with a little golden fork. Eating around him looked more like a delicate performance than a meal. Visitors had to learn the rules quickly. No dipping bread in shared sauces, no grabbing anything by hand, and definitely no licking fingers. That last one was considered a crime against the Duke's personal peace. Because of all this, some nobles made fun of him behind his back, calling him the Clean Duke, which honestly sounds more like a superhero on Laundry Day. But he didn't care. He believed his habits protected him from sickness, and in a time where illness spread easily, maybe he wasn't entirely wrong. His obsession became legendary during a royal feast. Imagine a giant hall filled with noisy guests, musicians playing, roasted meats carried around the room, and people laughing loudly. In the middle of all that, the Duke calmly washed his hands 12 times before the first course arrived. 12. People started placing bets on how many times he'd wash before dessert. By the time the night was over, they had counted 27 washes. Even the king teased him gently, saying, "My friend, if your hands get any cleaner, they might shine in the dark." The Duke simply smiled and said, "A shining hand is a sign of a shining heart." No one really knew what that meant, but it sounded deep, so everyone nodded politely. Of course, not everyone disliked his habits. The castle workers were happy he kept his rooms fresh, his clothes tidy, and his table orderly. In a messy medieval world, he brought a sense of calm. People felt safe around him. Children said he smelled like flowers. Dogs liked to follow him because he always had clean hands, which, for dogs, probably made him smell confusing but interesting. But there was one major problem: travel. When the Duke needed to move between estates, his entire hygiene system had to follow him. A cart full of towels, a cart full of water barrels, a group of servants carrying basins. Traveling with him looked more like a portable laundry festival than a noble journey. If they stopped at an inn, he refused to touch anything until the servants washed every surface. Once, he made them clean an entire room just so he could rest for 10 minutes. People who hosted him were warned ahead of time. Prepare basins, prepare towels, prepare patience. Some nobles panicked. They would scramble to prepare enough water, which wasn't as easy as turning on a tap back then. Buckets had to be hauled from wells, heated over fires, flavored with herbs, and then offered at the perfect temperature. Hosting him was exhausting. No one invited him twice unless they had to. Still, underneath his unusual habits, he was a good man. He was patient, thoughtful, and more gentle than most nobles. He never punished servants harshly. He thanked people constantly. Maybe washing his hands wasn't just about cleanliness. Maybe it helped him calm down in a world filled with chaos. Maybe it gave him structure and comfort. People noticed that he washed more often when he was stressed, and medieval life with its politics and uncertainties gave him plenty of reasons to wash. There's a famous story involving a visitor from another kingdom. The visitor tried to impress the Duke by washing his hands 3 times during dinner, thinking that was a huge effort. The Duke watched calmly, nodded, and then washed his own 5 times in a row as if saying, "Nice try, apprentice." The visitor later told people, "I have met a man cleaner than rainwater." Another tale speaks of a day when a cat jumped into the Duke's lap during an outdoor gathering. Everyone froze, knowing what would happen. The Duke stayed perfectly calm. He gently lifted the cat, placed it down, and then walked to the basin. Some say he washed his hands for 5 full minutes. Others say he washed until the sun began to set. Either way, the cat wandered off, completely unaware it had caused an emergency. By the time the Duke grew older, his habits had become almost comforting to those around him. People said you could always tell where he had been. The faint smell of herbs followed him like a little cloud. Children liked to run behind him and guessed which scent he would use next: lavender, rosemary, mint. When he passed away, some said the castle felt strangely quiet. No more gentle splashing sounds, no more soft rustling of towels, no more little groups of servants hurrying by with warm basins. The new lord of the region was far more normal and far less interesting. Today, historians smile when they talk about him. In a time when most people barely wash their hands at all, he chose to be the cleanest man in the kingdom. Maybe he was strange, maybe he was ahead of his time, or maybe he was simply someone who liked feeling fresh in a very unfresh age. Either way, his story reminds us that even in medieval times, when life was muddy, rough, and messy, some people tried to stay spotless inside and out.
There was a king who had a habit so strange, so quiet, and so peculiar that it would make modern readers blink. He loved collecting shadows. Not gold, not jewels, not tapestries or swords. Shadows. Dark, soft, fleeting shadows that appeared at certain times of the day and clung to walls, floors, and furniture like tiny, silent companions. And he loved them with a kind of gentle obsession that seemed perfectly normal to him and absolutely odd to everyone else. Every morning, the king would wake before sunrise. While other royals got up to prepare for councils or breakfasts, he would wander slowly through his private chambers, watching how the first light of day touched the walls. Where did shadows fall? How long did they stretch? How soft or sharp were the edges? If a shadow fell in a way he didn't like, he would quietly move a chair, a table, or even a small curtain to make it right. To him, a well-arranged shadow was like a good poem, calming, precise, and full of meaning. The servants quickly learned not to disturb him during this time. If someone entered without knocking, they might find him kneeling to adjust a shadow cast by a small candle, or bending down to shift a rug slightly so the shadows from the window didn't look angry. Medieval life was serious, full of politics and obligations. But in these quiet moments, the king lived in a little world entirely his own. No taxes, no battles, just shapes of darkness dancing with light. Visitors often noticed the king staring at walls in what seemed like deep thought. They assumed he was plotting strategies or studying maps. Little did they know, he was merely admiring the shape of a shadow from a goblet, watching it stretch and shrink across the marble floor. Sometimes he would smile softly when a shadow fell just right, as if the world had whispered a tiny secret meant only for him. This habit wasn't just for fun. The king genuinely believed that shadows held energy. A shadow that felt right could bring good luck or peace to the castle. A shadow that felt wrong might signal misfortune. Whether anyone else believed it or not, he treated shadows with respect. He even had a small journal where he drew outlines of the most beautiful shadows he observed, sometimes coloring them in with faint ink. Nobody else saw the journal. It was his private collection of quiet light and dark. Of course, maintaining perfect shadows wasn't easy in a big castle. Every candle,
torch, window, and curtain mattered. If a breeze shifted the curtains, he might wake at night just to move them back into the correct position. If someone left a chair in the wrong place, he would nudge it silently before anyone noticed. This kind of obsession could have been stressful if it were any other king, but for him, it was calming. It was his little ritual, a way to feel order in a world that often felt chaotic. One of the most amusing stories involves a visiting noble who saw the king kneeling before a particularly long shadow stretching across the hall. The noble whispered to another, "Is he praying?" The other whispered back, "No, I think he's worshipping a shadow." Of course, the king heard none of this. To him, shadows were not worshipped. They were appreciated, studied, and treated with gentle care. But imagining the noble's reaction makes you smile, doesn't it? The king also had rules about what could block shadows. He didn't allow anyone to move objects in certain corridors during his private hours. Servants tiptoed carefully, avoiding areas he had declared shadow zones. Sometimes a candle was moved just a few inches so that a shadow would stretch perfectly along the wall. Other times, he rearranged small statues, rugs, or even flower pots. It was delicate work, almost like composing music, but silent, soft, and invisible to most people. At night, the shadows changed again. The moonlight created new angles, new stretches of darkness, and new shapes to admire. The king would sometimes wander quietly along the halls, leaning against a wall, watching his favorite corners. He claimed that these quiet walks helped him sleep better. While most people tossed and turned, he felt peaceful, watching shadows dance, stretch, and settle in the corners of his castle. Sometimes he invited his closest confidants to observe, not often, only when he trusted someone completely. And even then, it wasn't to show off or lecture. He simply wanted to share the calm he felt when light met dark in just the right way. Some guests were confused. Some were enchanted. Most just smiled and nodded. It was hard not to when someone looked so happy kneeling by a candle and tracing the edges of a shadow like it was a living thing. There were occasional challenges. Storms could make shadows flicker unpredictably. Curtains could shift. A servant could accidentally block a window. And when that happened, the king would quietly reset everything. He never shouted, he never got angry. He simply fixed it, walked back to his chair, and continued observing. In some ways, the calmness of shadows reminded him to remain calm himself. Medieval life was loud, unpredictable, and often harsh. But shadows were gentle, and they obeyed the laws of physics perfectly, unlike humans. Interestingly, his fascination didn't interfere with ruling. Some historians suggest that observing shadows might have improved his patience, attention to detail, and focus. After all, to notice the subtle stretch of light across a wall, you must be careful, calm, and aware. Maybe these quiet moments gave him the mental clarity to make better decisions, handle arguments, and manage his advisors. Maybe shadows taught him lessons in subtlety and balance. By the time the king grew older, he had mapped hundreds of shadows throughout the castle. He could tell you the exact shape cast by a vase at dawn, the way a candlestick fell at noon, and how a tapestry caught the afternoon sun. His personal collection was invisible to most people, yet it shaped his life quietly, gently, and beautifully. When he passed away, there were no royal records of his shadow hobby. No tapestries were made, no portraits painted of him kneeling next to a shadow. But those who served him remembered. They remembered a man who found comfort, peace, and perhaps even magic in the quiet corners of his castle. A man who could sit for hours, watching light and dark play together and feel like the world was just right. His story reminds us that even in medieval times, when life was harsh, cold, and full of expectations, people still found private ways to feel calm. Some prayed, some bathed, some listened to goats, and some just watched shadows. letting them stretch, shrink, and dance. And maybe in a strange, sleepy way, that's the most human of all habits.
There was a princess whose peculiar habit involved something most people would barely notice, her fingernails. But not in the way you might imagine. She didn't paint them with bright colors or decorate them with jewels. She collected them. Yes, her fingernails, carefully trimmed, dried, and stored in little boxes. And she loved them. She loved them like some people love stamps, coins, or tiny trinkets from travels. Every week, the princess would sit quietly at her vanity, carefully clipping her nails. Not a single piece was thrown away. Each nail was cleaned, polished in a subtle way, and placed in a little container. Some containers were carved wood, some were tiny glass jars, and some were little boxes lined with soft velvet. She even kept a small label with the date, sometimes noting the moon phase or what she had eaten that day. The level of organization was impressive, even if a bit unusual. Why did she do this? Some historians suggest she was fascinated by patterns, by growth, by the quiet reminder of time passing. Nails grow slowly, almost imperceptibly. By keeping them, she could track her own small changes, almost like a secret diary in tiny fragments. Others whispered that she believed these tiny pieces of herself held power or perhaps memories. But the truth might have been simpler. She enjoyed order and quiet rituals in a world that was loud, unpredictable, and full of obligations. Her habit didn't interfere with her duties, though. It did confuse her servants at first. When she asked them to fetch new little boxes for the nails, they thought she wanted jewelry boxes or trinkets. When she labeled the jars with tiny notes, they wondered if it was a secret code. Over time, they learned. This was the princess's private system, her way of keeping the world in soft control. She even developed rules around the collection. Nails had to be completely dry before being stored. They had to be placed in a quiet room away from sunlight, because sunlight could disturb their essence, she explained politely. She preferred jars to boxes in some cases because jars let her see each piece clearly, while boxes made her feel like she was hiding them from the world. Every detail mattered. Some of her habits were a little funny. She would occasionally ask her sister or a trusted friend to admire the nails, not to judge them, not to comment on shape or size, just to look and nod politely. "See how orderly they are?" she would say, and the friend would nod. And yes, sometimes visitors were confused. Imagine stepping into a quiet chamber and being asked to study fingernails. But the princess didn't mind. She was gentle, kind, and never insisted if someone didn't understand. Her nail collection even influenced her daily routine. She would wash her hands carefully before clipping, making sure no dirt or oil interfered with the final product. She trimmed at the same time every week, always during the soft afternoon light. She sometimes hummed quietly while working, a little ritual to help her focus. The process was slow, meditative, and strangely soothing. Interestingly, the princess sometimes used her nail collection as a way to reflect. She could glance at her jars and see weeks, months, and even years of her life documented in small fragments. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't flashy. It was just a quiet record of her existence. And in a time when women of noble birth often had little personal freedom, this tiny habit was hers alone. One amusing story involves a visiting nobleman who accidentally knocked over one of the jars. He turned pale, expecting fury, drama, or at least a loud scolding. The princess, however, calmly picked up the pieces, sorted them, and said softly, "Some were rearranged, but the collection survives." He left bewildered, thinking he had narrowly escaped a curse. The servants laughed quietly afterwards, noting that only someone as gentle and unusual as this princess could treat fingernails with such reverence. The collection became a private treasure, never displayed publicly, never flaunted, but always present in her life. It reminded her of continuity, growth, and her own gentle order in a kingdom that demanded attention and obedience at every hour.
Every trimmed nail was a quiet victory over chaos, a small comfort in a world filled with grand decisions and unpredictable events. Later in life, she passed the habit to a trusted niece, explaining carefully how to store, label, and admire the nails. Not everyone understood it, but her niece appreciated the quiet ritual, the patience, and the subtle way it encouraged reflection. Some historians think this is one reason the family became known for unusual but harmless hobbies, all fostering mindfulness and calm amidst the pressures of royal life. In the end, the princess's fingernail collection was more than just a quirk. It was a meditation, a record, and a personal form of order. It was her way of connecting with herself in an era that demanded conformity, obedience, and constant attention to social expectations. And while we may chuckle at the idea, it also reminds us that everyone, even medieval royals, found comfort in small, private rituals that seemed silly or strange to the outside world. As we imagine her sitting quietly at her vanity, sunlight spilling softly through a nearby window, jars of tiny nails lined up nicely in front of her, it's easy to picture the calm she felt. In that gentle world of clipping, drying, and storing, the princess found her own version of peace, a soft, meditative rhythm that helped her navigate the louder, harsher world outside her chamber walls. So, while most people remember medieval royals for battles, politics, or grand feasts, this princess reminds us that the quiet, strange, personal habits often tell the truest story of who someone was. Small, private routines, no matter how unusual, can provide comfort, calm, and a gentle sense of control in an unpredictable world. And in a time when everyone had roles to play, she created one just for herself, one that required patience, mindfulness, and perhaps a little imagination.
There was a duke who had a fascination with shoes. Not collecting shoes like a modern fashionista, and not fancy, jewel-encrusted royal shoes either. No, he was obsessed with the smell of shoes. Old shoes, new shoes, leather shoes, soft slippers, he loved to sniff them. And this was a habit he'd tried and mostly failed to keep private. Every morning, the Duke would begin his day not by dressing, eating, or attending council meetings, but by carefully checking the footwear in his chambers. He had a small collection of his own shoes, yes, but he also kept a few from servants and visiting nobles. Not in a creepy way, well, maybe a little, but it was more like a ritual. Each shoe had its own scent story. A well-worn boot smelled of distant travels, horse stables, and pine forests. A slipper just worn indoors might smell faintly of bread or lavender. To him, every scent told a story, and he wanted to read them each morning. Servants quickly learned to leave shoes out carefully. No sudden bumps, no stepping on them, no mixing them up. If shoes were misplaced, the Duke would quietly frown and mutter something about the lost aroma of experience. Visitors sometimes caught him crouched on the floor, carefully lifting a pair of boots to inhale softly. Most pretended not to notice, though some left quickly, unsure whether this was tradition, madness, or both. He didn't just sniff shoes for fun. The Duke claimed it helped him make decisions. Worried about who to trust in a negotiation, he would smell the shoes of the visiting noble, carefully assessing their journey, energy, and mood. Some servants later joked that the Duke could predict battle outcomes based on socks alone, though we'll never know how much of that was exaggeration. His obsession extended beyond boots and slippers. Sometimes he'd ask the royal shoemaker to create new shoes just so he could enjoy the first scent of creation. The shoemaker, bewildered but polite, would carefully craft the shoes, let the leather cure, and then present them to the Duke for inspection. A compliment from the Duke could make a craftsman's career. A faint frown could send the shoemaker scrambling back to his workshop. The funniest stories involve guests who unknowingly left their shoes in the Duke's presence. One visiting lord removed his boots after a long journey, set them near the fire, and forgot about them. The Duke noticed immediately,
crouched and sniffed deeply. The lord turned around to see his host apparently kneeling in reverence to a pair of boots. The duke merely nodded approvingly and said, "Excellent travel aroma, well-traveled like the wind itself." The lord politely left the room, utterly confused, and never forgot the encounter. Even during formal events, the duke had his routines. Before entering a room, he sometimes paused to adjust his own footwear or subtly smell it, ensuring he carried the correct scent into gatherings. Some courtiers whispered that this was a kind of mindfulness, though others suspected he just loved shoes too much. Either way, his habits became an accepted, if unusual, part of court life. Traveling presented its own challenges. Wherever he went, the duke insisted on bringing his private collection, plus the shoes of any companions he trusted. In inns or castles, servants had to prepare a small corner where the duke could check, arrange, and inspect shoes. Not following this protocol could lead to confusion, awkwardness, or a very quiet but firm frown from the duke. One legendary incident involved a royal wedding. The duke was a guest, but his habit could not be ignored. During the reception, he noticed the groom's boots were polished with a slightly sour leather scent. He excused himself, retrieved a small vial of water, cleaned the boots, and sniffed again before returning. Guests whispered behind their fans. Even the bride reportedly raised an eyebrow. But the duke seemed satisfied, and that's all that mattered. Interestingly, his habit didn't interfere with his duties. In fact, some historians suggest it may have helped him focus. In a time when nobles were distracted by politics, gossip, and endless meetings, taking a moment to slow down, assess the aroma environment, and practice patience may have given him mental clarity. Perhaps sniffing shoes wasn't mere obsession, it was meditation, concentration, and a quirky form of stress relief all in one. As the duke grew older, he refined his routine. He began labeling shoes with notes about where they had been, who had worn them, and the quality of the leather. He even had small cloth bags for travel, ensuring that scents didn't mix or fade. Some people thought he had lost his mind, but anyone who spent time around him knew he was calm, thoughtful, and strangely wise. By the time of his death, his collection had become legendary. People spoke quietly of the duke who loved shoes more than gold, who understood journeys and moods through leather and cloth, and who found peace in the soft, personal ritual of smelling carefully curated footwear. For him, shoes weren't just objects. They were companions, stories, and private comforts in a world of noise and duty. And perhaps that's the hidden charm in his story. In a world obsessed with displays of power, titles, and gold, this duke found his own quiet pleasure. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't meant to impress anyone, it wasn't even practical, but it brought him calm, curiosity, and a strange but gentle kind of joy. So, as we imagine the duke kneeling quietly on the polished floor of a castle chamber, inhaling softly from a pair of travel-worn boots, it's easy to smile. A man who found comfort in something so ordinary yet so personal reminds us that human habits, no matter how unusual, often reflect the search for calm in an unpredictable world. And as we leave him carefully arranging shoes by size, scent, and origin, we drift gently toward the next medieval royal, someone whose love for animals, late-night snacks, or odd collections may seem strange, but like the duke's shoes, is strangely endearing and very human.
There was a king who had an unusual obsession, eating at very precise times, often in the middle of the night. Unlike most royals who had grand feasts during the day and maybe a small snack before bed, this king believed that midnight snacks were not only essential, they were sacred. And not just any snack would do. It had to be prepared in a very specific way, with the right temperature, seasoning, and presentation. The king's nightly routine began long before the castle clock struck 12. Servants were quietly instructed to prepare small trays of food. Soft breads, warm milk, small roasted meats, and sometimes a hint of honey or herbs. Everything was carefully measured. Nothing too sweet, nothing too heavy. The king wanted comfort food, not a feast, and he wanted it right on time, no earlier, no later. If the tray arrived too early, he would wave it away with a small, polite frown. Too late? A gentle sigh. And sometimes, if the timing was off, he would request that the food be returned, reheated, and brought again at the precise moment. People might think this was strict or demanding, but to him, it was about rhythm, peace, and the calm that came with following a quiet schedule. His love for these midnight meals started when he was a child. He remembered sneaking into the kitchen as a young prince, hungry from evening lessons, and sharing small bites with a trusted servant. That quiet act of rebellion, combined with the comfort of warm bread and milk, left a lasting impression. As king, he continued the habit, though with much more order, ceremony, and attention to detail. Servants who worked the midnight shift learned to move silently. They tiptoed through cold stone halls, balancing trays with great care, and ensured that no candle flickered too brightly, no floorboard groaned, and no dog barked at the wrong time. It was a delicate dance, but one that the staff eventually mastered. Some even admitted that, strange as it seemed, they enjoyed the quietness, the calm, and the gentle ritual of feeding the king while the rest of the castle slept. Not all midnight meals were elaborate. Sometimes it was just bread, sometimes cheese, sometimes a soft-boiled egg. But even these simple foods were handled with precision. Napkins were folded exactly 3 times, spoons were polished, and dishes were arranged in a specific order. Eating, for this king, wasn't just about nourishment, it was about creating a tiny moment of peace and order in a chaotic world. One night, a visiting ambassador arrived unexpectedly. He expected to find a quiet castle, perhaps a few guards, and maybe a candle burning. Instead, he found a small procession moving quietly through the halls, servants carrying trays, a few candles in careful formation, and the king himself, calm and smiling, waiting for his midnight meal. The ambassador was startled. When he asked why this ritual existed, a servant whispered, "It is the king's moment of peace." The ambassador nodded slowly, deciding not to ask further. The king's habit sometimes affected council meetings. Ministers learned never to schedule urgent discussions too close to midnight. If someone dared, the king might excuse himself politely, saying, "I cannot make decisions on an empty stomach." The ministers, having witnessed a king eat bread with such calm precision, learned to respect the timing. And perhaps, in a way, these midnight meals helped the kingdom. A well-fed, peaceful king made better decisions than one who was hungry, restless, or grumpy. His favorite foods were simple: warm bread soaked in honey, a little soft cheese, roasted chestnuts in the winter, and sometimes a tiny slice of roasted meat. All served in small portions, just enough to satisfy but not overfill. And sometimes, if he felt particularly nostalgic, a small sweet pastry reminiscent of his childhood appeared on the tray. The staff enjoyed making these, knowing it would make him happy, and he always thanked them with a soft smile and a quiet word of appreciation. Interestingly, the king's midnight meals were also a source of creativity. He sometimes used the quiet hours to sketch plans, write letters, or think about the kingdom. Some historians suggest that these late-night snacks helped him think more clearly, free from the distractions, noise, and demands of daytime life. Perhaps the combination of quiet, calm, and warm food sharpened his mind, giving him insight and patience that other rulers lacked. There's a famous story about a winter night when a snowstorm trapped travelers near the castle. The king, noticing their plight, ordered small trays prepared and carried to the guests without waking them fully. Bread, cheese, and warm milk appeared quietly at their doorsteps. The travelers were astonished. They didn't understand why a king would care for strangers in the middle of the night, but they never forgot it. And some historians think that such acts of quiet kindness helped build loyalty in the kingdom. Of course, there were occasional mishaps. Once a tray of warm bread fell, sending crumbs across the stone floor. The king did not scold the servant. Instead, he quietly instructed them to sweep up the crumbs,
reheat the bread, and bring a fresh tray. Calm, gentle, methodical. Never dramatic, never harsh. That was the king's style. Even when things went wrong, he maintained a sense of peace that everyone in the castle learned to admire. By the end of his life, the king's midnight ritual had become legendary. People spoke of it quietly, with amusement and a little awe. The king who ate in the middle of the night, always on time, always calmly, had found a way to carve peace and rhythm out of a world that rarely allowed it. And perhaps that is why his reign is remembered, not only for politics or battles, but for the quiet human comforts that kept him grounded, calm, and kind. As we leave the king enjoying a small bite of bread by candlelight, the castle silent around him, it's easy to understand why strange habits sometimes endure. They are not just quirks, they're ways to find calm, joy, and personal peace in a world full of obligations, noise, and uncertainty. And in a time when most people were hungry, cold, or anxious, this king's simple ritual was, in its own way, a gentle rebellion, a moment of quiet care for oneself in a chaotic world.
There was a queen who had a habit that might sound strange today, but in her time it was considered almost strategic. She collected whispers. Not gossip, not secrets in the usual sense, but actual whispers, quiet voices, murmurs, soft-spoken words that drifted across rooms, corridors, and gardens. And she listened to them with rapt attention, storing them in her mind as if each one were a tiny treasure. The queen's fascination with whispers began when she was a child, growing up in a castle with endless corridors, echoing halls, and hidden nooks. She loved the way sound traveled in these spaces, the gentle murmur of a servant speaking to another in a distant room, the soft conversation of courtiers preparing for a feast, even the quiet hiss of the wind through cracks in the walls. There was a rhythm to whispers, a life all their own, and she found them endlessly fascinating. As she grew older, her habit became more intentional. She would quietly sit in chambers or hidden corners, listening to the faintest voices, trying to understand the stories, feelings, and patterns they carried. Some people called it eavesdropping. Others called it clever strategy. The queen didn't care about labels. She simply loved the calm, secret world of quiet sounds. Her collection wasn't physical. It existed entirely in her mind. She remembered conversations in astonishing detail, the way a servant nervously rearranged silver spoons, the subtle tension in a noble's voice when discussing taxes, or the soft laughter of children playing in the gardens. Each whisper became a thread in the rich tapestry of her kingdom's life. She could read people in ways others could not, simply because she had paid attention to the softest details. Servants and courtiers quickly learned to be careful with their tones. They knew that the queen heard more than they realized. Loud voices, abrupt words, or careless remarks were noted, remembered, and sometimes acted upon. But unlike many rulers, the queen did not punish carelessly. She was gentle, preferring to use her knowledge quietly, guiding her court with subtlety rather than harshness. One of the most amusing aspects of her habit involved the royal library. Scholars and scribes often whispered while reading, discussing translations of old texts. The queen loved this. She would wander quietly among them, listening without disturbing their work. Sometimes she would nod softly, making tiny adjustments to their studies, rearranging books, or suggesting subtle changes in phrasing. Scholars initially thought she was a ghost haunting the library, until they realized she was very much alive and very much listening. Her fascination with whispers even extended to the castle gardens. Courtiers walking on gravel paths would speak softly, feeling that the queen might overhear. Servants tending the flowers discovered that even the softest instructions might reach her ears. Birds, wind, and water in fountains became part of her auditory landscape, all combining with human whispers to create a symphony of subtle sound that she cherished.
Interestingly, this habit also made the queen an excellent judge of character. She could detect nervousness, excitement, or dishonesty from the faintest tremor in a voice. Courtiers who tried to lie, exaggerate, or manipulate quickly realized she often already knew the truth. Her quiet listening allowed her to make informed decisions without needing confrontations or dramatic accusations. It was strategy wrapped in softness, a powerful combination in a kingdom where loud displays of power were the norm. One famous incident involved a visiting ambassador who whispered a clever but false tale about a neighboring kingdom. The queen, having overheard him while he thought no one was listening, subtly corrected the misunderstanding in a meeting later, without ever confronting him directly. The ambassador left thinking the queen had magical insight. In reality, she just listened carefully, paying attention to the whispers everyone else ignored. Her habit also provided comfort. Life as a queen was filled with noise, political arguments, feasts, celebrations, and constant duties. Whispers offered her a gentle refuge. They were soft, quiet, intimate. Listening became a kind of meditation, a way to stay calm and centered amidst the chaos of the castle. Many who observed her noticed that after spending time in quiet corners, she returned to public life with a serene, almost otherworldly calm. Even in her later years, the queen maintained this gentle habit. She trained trusted attendants to speak softly in her presence, knowing that the subtle rhythms of conversation could provide insights or simply calm her mind. Visitors quickly learned the unspoken rule: when in the queen's presence, lower your voice, speak slowly, and let the whispers carry their meaning. Loudness was unnecessary. Subtlety reigned supreme. Historians today find it fascinating that the queen's obsession with whispers was both personal and political. It helped her govern wisely, understand her court, and maintain peace in a kingdom where power often relied on noise and spectacle. At the same time, it provided her with moments of quiet reflection, a gentle connection to the softer side of life that others rarely noticed. As we imagine her, quietly seated in a dimly lit corner of the castle, hearing the faintest sounds float toward her, it's easy to see why this habit endured. Life was harsh, noisy, and full of expectations, but in whispers, she found peace, clarity, and insight. In the quiet, soft corners of the castle, she created her own little sanctuary, a gentle kingdom within a kingdom, and perhaps the most unusual and delicate habit of all.
There was a prince who had a habit that made him both feared and admired. He loved to talk to his food. Not jokingly, not in public, and not to show off. No, he genuinely spoke to every meal before eating it. Bread, cheese, fruit, roasted meats, even soups. He greeted them, complimented them, and sometimes apologized for eating them. His habit started as a child. His mother had told him that gratitude was important, even for small things. But while most children said a quiet "thank you" before meals, he took it to a new level. He whispered little words to each dish, admired its color and texture, and even commented on its aroma. To him, food was alive in a very soft, respectful way, and acknowledging it made meals feel like small ceremonies. Servants initially found this strange. Imagine setting a tray before a prince and hearing him murmur, "Ah, noble bread, you smell delightful today. May your crust be crisp and your crumb soft." At first, they stifled giggles. Then, over time, they learned the proper rhythm so as not to disturb his ritual. By the time he became a young man, the habit was fully accepted. Servants moved quietly, knowing the prince needed his private conversation with the food before touching it. The prince spoke in soft tones, almost meditative. Sometimes he told a carrot, "You have traveled far to reach me. Thank you for your service." A roasted chicken might receive a comment on the quality of its golden skin. Even milk or water was treated with reverence. "Ah, cool and soothing, I am grateful for your gentle arrival." His manners with food were extraordinary. He never rushed, never gabbled, and never treated the ritual lightly.
Interestingly, this habit had a practical side. By taking the time to observe and speak to each dish, he naturally noticed its freshness, quality, and temperature. Spoiled bread or sour milk would not escape his attention. He learned to assess ingredients carefully, often before anyone else in the castle realized there was a problem. In a strange way, his ritual kept the kitchens honest and the food high quality. Guests sometimes observed him and were unsure whether to laugh or remain polite. One visiting duke once murmured to his companion, "Does he really speak to the food?" The companion whispered back, "Shh, perhaps it grants him strength." Indeed, some believed the prince's strange habit gave him energy, calmness, and a sharp mind. After all, a ruler who respected the small details in life could likely respect the large ones too. At banquets, he would often whisper briefly to each dish before taking the first bite. Others had to be patient. Some nobles tried to mimic him, but it never had the same effect. He spoke naturally, without theatrics, and the food seemed to receive his words with, well, it seemed right to him at least. Servants sometimes whispered back jokingly when he wasn't looking, pretending the roasted meats were nodding politely. His habit also extended to leftovers. He would not simply toss uneaten food aside. He might murmur, "You have done your duty, rest well," before sending it to the kitchen for later use. He believed every meal deserved respect, even when it was finished. Medieval kingdoms were often wasteful, so his habit quietly promoted mindfulness, though no one else realized it at the time. Traveling with this habit was challenging. In inns, he needed private meals so he could perform his ritual without interruption. Sometimes, cooks were confused when he whispered thanks to a loaf of bread or a jug of water, but the prince was patient. He explained gently, "Food gives us strength. A quiet word is the least we can offer." Travelers and foreign visitors were often bewildered but charmed by the gentle seriousness of his habit. One famous story involves a banquet in the Great Hall where dozens of guests waited impatiently. The prince was speaking softly to a tray of fruit when the king of a neighboring land asked, "Why does he talk to his food?" The prince looked up, smiled, and said softly, "Because it gives me life, and life deserves words of gratitude." No one knew quite what to say, so they nodded politely, secretly thinking the young prince was either very wise or very strange, or perhaps both. His habit also had a calming effect. Mealtime could be stressful in a medieval court, with tension, politics, and the endless pressure of appearances. But for the prince, these quiet conversations created a moment of peace. Chewing bread while speaking softly to it became meditation. Listening to the soft crackle of roasted meat while whispering thanks became a tiny ritual that made the world feel manageable. Servants learned to respect the silence and the pace. If someone spoke too loudly or moved too quickly near the prince, he would gently pause and wait. There was a rhythm to his eating, and anyone who disturbed it risked a polite but firm correction. Over time, the castle staff began to enjoy the calm. Nights when the prince dined quietly were peaceful, soft, and almost enchanting. By the time he reached adulthood, his habit had become fully integrated into his personality. Courtiers, guests, and family members accepted it, understanding that it brought him calm, focus, and perhaps even joy. Food to him was not just sustenance, it was a companion, a teacher, and a source of comfort. And in a world where chaos and noise were constant, this small ritual gave him serenity.
There was a count who had a habit that made everyone scratch their heads. He loved to sleep with his pets. Not just dogs or cats, but every small animal he could keep in his chambers. Rabbits, birds, and sometimes even squirrels. He insisted they all have a place beside him when he slept. And it wasn't just for comfort. He genuinely believed that sleeping near animals brought him good dreams, calm nights, and gentle energy. The Count's love for animals began in childhood, growing up in a castle where hunting was common, and animals were mostly viewed as property or food. But he was different. He loved the quiet presence of living creatures. A rabbit nibbling quietly on hay, a cat curling up on a soft pillow, a bird perching gently on the windowsill. These companions soothed him, made him feel calm,
and gave him a sense of warmth that neither riches nor titles could provide. By the time he became an adult, he had a whole system. Servants were responsible for bringing clean hay, small baskets, and comfortable bedding for each animal. A cat might have its own cushion, a bird its own perch. Even small rodents had tiny, cozy spaces so they could be near him without making a mess. The Count arranged everything with careful precision, because chaos was stressful, even for pets. At night, he would gently place each animal around his bed, whispering softly to them before settling under the covers himself. Dogs might snuggle close, while rabbits crouched at the foot of the bed, and birds perched on a nearby shelf. Squirrels, if present, often caused tiny disturbances, but the Count handled them with patience, gently nudging them to settle down. To him, this wasn't strange. It was peaceful, normal, and necessary for a good night's sleep. Servants sometimes found the habit amusing, especially when animals made noise or caused small chaos. A bird might flap its wings too loudly, a rabbit might hop onto the bed at the wrong moment, and dogs might snore in perfect unison. Yet the Count remained calm, gently adjusting, whispering, and soothing, until everyone, human and animal alike, was settled. Traveling with this habit presented unique challenges. He insisted on bringing his animals along when moving between estates or castles. Some nobles worried about the smell, the mess, or the disturbance, but he was gentle yet firm. "Animals bring peace," he would say softly, "and I cannot sleep without them." Servants learned to pack small baskets, carry cages discreetly, and ensure every creature was comfortable. The journey often resembled a traveling menagerie, but it was done quietly, with care, and without drawing unnecessary attention. The Count also had specific rules about who could handle his pets at night. Only trusted servants were allowed in his chambers once the animals were arranged. Strangers or casual visitors were politely asked to leave, as he believed the energy of unfamiliar humans disturbed the calm balance of the room. This might sound odd, but in a time when castles were noisy, drafty, and unpredictable, the Count had created a small sanctuary of warmth, softness, and safety. Some stories tell of nights when guests were allowed to stay in the chamber. They would find the Count sleeping calmly, animals arranged around him in precise order, a rabbit at the foot of the bed, a dog curled to the side, a cat perched nearby, and birds softly chirping from their perch. Visitors often whispered about the scene, unsure whether it was endearing, strange, or slightly magical. Most simply decided to remain silent and respect the Count's private ritual. Interestingly, this habit also had political benefits. The calm, gentle energy the Count felt after a night of sleeping with his pets seemed to influence his mood, decisions, and interactions during the day. Courtiers noted that he was patient, thoughtful, and remarkably steady, even during tense meetings or disputes. They attributed this partly to the unusual companionship of his pets and partly to the quiet, meditative rhythm of arranging them each night. There's a charming story of a winter night when the castle was blanketed with snow and a visiting diplomat was forced to stay in the Count's chamber. The animals were settled, the warmth from the bedding was comforting, and the visitor was nervous about disturbing the Count's routine. But the Count simply offered a small blanket for the guest and whispered, "Rest well. The animals approve." That night, the visitor reportedly slept better than he had in years, surrounded by calm, quiet creatures and the gentle presence of the Count. By the time the Count grew older, his habit was fully accepted by those around him. Servants, family members, and trusted courtiers understood the need for calm, soft energy and the importance of the nightly ritual. They sometimes joked quietly about it, but no one ever questioned its necessity. To the Count, it was as essential as eating, bathing, or reading. Animals were companions, guardians of dreams, and a source of emotional stability. Historians today often smile at the story, imagining a castle chamber filled with rabbits, cats, dogs, birds, and perhaps even a few squirrels, all arranged with care around a sleeping noble. But it also offers a gentle reminder. Even in the harsh, unpredictable world of medieval life, people sought comfort in small, private rituals. For the Count, these creatures provided warmth, calm, and a quiet joy that no amount of gold or power could replace. As we picture him settling under the blankets, animals quietly finding their places, and the room filled with soft, calm energy, it's easy to see why his habit endured. Strange, perhaps, endearing, certainly, but human, absolutely. And in the quiet, gentle rhythm of sleeping with his pets, the Count discovered a small, personal sanctuary in the middle of a turbulent medieval world.
And finally, there was a king whose habit was perhaps the most unusual of all. He loved to count everything. Not just coins or livestock, but tiles on the floor, beams in the ceiling, steps along the hallway, and even clouds in the sky. He would spend hours quietly observing, tallying, and noting patterns in the world around him. And while it might sound obsessive or dull, for him it was a source of calm, comfort, and a gentle sense of control in a chaotic world. The king's fascination with counting began as a child, growing up in a castle full of endless stone corridors and vast halls. While other children played with toys or practiced swordsmanship, he would sit quietly on a stone step, counting the cracks in the walls, the knots in the wood, or the shapes in the clouds above the tower. His family initially thought it was a harmless quirk, but they soon realized that counting brought him peace. It was a way to make sense of the world, to impose quiet order on chaos, and to feel calm when life seemed unpredictable. As he grew older, the habit expanded. Coins were counted repeatedly, not to hoard or obsess over wealth, but simply because the rhythm of counting was soothing. Livestock were tallied daily, not to enforce strict management, but to maintain a gentle sense of awareness and calm. Every detail mattered, and every pattern had meaning. To the king, noticing details was like listening to a soft, steady melody, something comforting and reassuring in a world full of uncertainty. His counting was quiet, methodical, and deliberate. Servants learned to move slowly in his presence. A dropped spoon or a misaligned chair might cause a pause, not out of anger, but because the symmetry, the order, or the number of items suddenly seemed off to him. He would quietly adjust the items, recount, and return to his serene observation, never raising his voice, never causing alarm. Visitors often found this habit odd. Imagine entering a grand hall to find a king crouched by a hearth, quietly counting floor tiles, murmuring numbers under his breath, and smiling softly at the rhythm. Some laughed, some were confused, others quietly stepped around him, sensing that interrupting this gentle ritual would be unwise. And the king, entirely absorbed in the rhythm of counting, hardly noticed them anyway. He even counted things that could not be easily counted. Clouds drifting across the sky were a favorite pastime, as were birds flying across the courtyard. He counted the way shadows stretched along walls, how leaves fell from trees, and the faint cracks in the castle walls. Some of his advisors worried that he might be losing focus on governance, but over time they realized that counting brought him clarity. By noticing the small details, he became aware of patterns, rhythms, and behaviors in the world around him that others overlooked. One amusing story involves a visiting noble who tried to impress the king with a grand speech about battle plans. The king listened quietly, nodded politely, and then, without warning, counted the number of tiles in the floor beneath them. The noble paused, unsure whether this was a compliment, a sign of boredom, or something entirely different. The king simply smiled and continued, unfazed. For him, numbers and patterns were comforting, and no speech, however grand, could replace the peace of counting quietly.
counting also became a private meditation. When the kingdom grew loud with disputes, festivals, or ceremonies, the king would retreat to quiet rooms, corridors, or balconies, focusing on the rhythm of numbers. Steps on a staircase became a mantra. Tiles on the floor became a meditation. Even clouds drifting across the sky became a kind of soft, moving pattern to watch. The habit kept him calm, patient, and surprisingly resilient. Interestingly, the habit influenced his leadership. Advisors later reported that the king was incredibly observant, noticing details others overlooked. Misplaced banners, missing coins, or subtle shifts in mood among courtiers rarely escaped his attention. And though he never made counting a public affair, the habit gave him quiet insight into the workings of his court and kingdom. In a way, counting was both personal comfort and a subtle form of intelligence. Traveling presented its own challenges. Courtiers often had to accommodate the king's quiet rituals, ensuring he could count steps along castle halls, floor tiles in inns, or stones on bridges without interruption. Some nobles found it tedious or absurd, but the king's calm demeanor reminded them that these rituals, however strange, brought him peace and focus. And a calm ruler, after all, is a kind ruler. By the end of his life, the king had counted thousands of things, recorded patterns in his mind, and quietly organized a world that seemed chaotic to others. His habit was never documented in official records. There were no grand scrolls declaring the king who counted everything. Yet those who served him remembered him as patient, gentle, and wise, qualities perhaps strengthened by countless quiet hours spent in meditation through numbers. And so, as we imagine him, softly counting floor tiles in a sunlit corridor, smiling at the rhythm, and feeling a sense of order in the chaos of medieval life, we see the gentle beauty of a strange habit. In a world filled with wars, taxes, and obligations, this king found peace in numbers. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson of all these strange royal habits, that even the most unusual routines can provide calm, insight, and comfort in a noisy, unpredictable world. Strange, human, and quietly charming, counting became his secret, his meditation, and his way of connecting with the world. And as we drift off imagining him softly whispering numbers to the walls, tiles, and clouds, it's easy to feel the same calm he must have felt, a gentle reminder that even in the strangest of habits, there can be a quiet, sleepy peace waiting to be found.